We've done several meta-analyses. Protein does not cause kidney failure. I think it's important to realize that you're not going to make your bones brittle or weak by having a high protein diet. But again, it's still important to get calcium and vitamin D dialed in because they're the two main bone supportive nutrients for sure. But I think people have become very polarized in their views, and it's become now a battle of philosophy rather than science. But the reality is that if you're eating those plant-based things, you just got to eat a little bit more protein. I don't have a horse in the race and everything, but I would have said 20 years ago, protein is king. It's super important. You got to get it. You got to eat more. And now it's sort of like, nah, it's a thin slice on top. You bake the cake. In other words, you make the muscle by going to the gym, by lifting weights and doing it regularly. If you really want to tweak things, then eat a little bit more protein. I'd say a little bit, like twice the RDA, so 1.6. So it's not a trivial amount. It is more than is recommended. But what it adds is it's a layer of icing on the cake. And that really pisses people off.
Stu, you have this great analogy comparing muscle to a brick wall. I'll have you walk me through that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a great analogy, but it's one that works. Muscle is made up of bricks. There are 20 bricks. There are 20 amino acids that make up protein. And so, the bricks build the wall. I think the analogy is pretty apt because, you look at some walls and they're just built, they look great. And then, a couple of years later, they don't look so great. And so you think, oh, maybe I should take that brick out. It's not looking so good. And so you replace it with another brick, you replace it with a new brick. And that concept of turning over the wall, putting new bricks in and taking old bricks out is one that I think is, it's pretty apt because that's exactly how things work in muscle. The difference is it's not taken out every 10 years. It's taken out, 1.5% of all the bricks every day get pulled out and replaced. And so I have a good friend and colleague named Luc van Loon, who's from the Netherlands. And, he likes to say, when you look at your arm, it's a different arm in about 60 days from a muscle perspective. And he's spot on. Your muscle's completely new, which, that still blows me away. I think it's a pretty cool feature of muscle, but not just muscle. Like every tissue in your body does the same thing, but we study muscle, so that's the one that fascinates me.
Well, I like the analogy a lot because this muscle protein synthesis, or MPS, can be a very abstract term. I guess it's not so abstract, but it's hard to conceptualize. And I think the brick wall really puts that into perspective with the MPS and the muscle protein degradation. So you've already gotten into really general overview, but let's get into some of the nuances, what we want to do to make sure we're regulating both of those processes, the degradation, the building, and the balance between the two.
Yeah, there's two main stimuli that push bricks going into the wall. The first one is you eat food, protein-containing food. When you're a kid, it's a little different. You've got all kinds of growth factors and hormones going on, and you're growing, height, width, everything, and often point out to people the period in your life where you grew the most, like bar none, was between, the day you were born and year one, right? You probably doubled in weight or something like that. Like you never do that again. Hopefully not when you're an adult as well. It's the eating and the consumption of protein that's putting net bricks into the wall. And they obviously stay there over a period of time. And the wall begins to get bigger. Bones begin to get longer. And, I point out to a lot of people, your bones are actually 40% by composition protein. So they're getting built up just like the brick wall of muscle as well. But so is every other organ, and your skin's getting bigger and everything else like that. So I think that that's a key part of understanding, how are we going to regulate these processes? It's definitely protein driven. The other, after you're done being a kid and you're done growing in terms of, hormonally driven and growth factor driven growth, then is exercise. And, resistance exercise or weightlifting is obviously the primary stimulator for muscle, and it promotes and makes your muscle more sensitive to the protein that you consume, and you put more bricks into the wall. At the same time, it actually promotes a little bit more protein degradation too. So the overall turnover gets a little faster. We just tip the scale in the direction where synthesis is greater than breakdown. And so muscle mass is going to go up. So it's really two things, outside of when you're a kid, it's food, it's protein, and resistance exercise. Not that other forms of exercise can't do it, but the further you get around, sort of endurance-ish, then you're not going to make mass as much as you are. You're going to recreate things inside the wall, and that would be mitochondria and build aerobic capacity.
So on one end of the spectrum, the synthesis, we have the diet and the exercise as inputs. I think it was in the exercise realm, you mentioned degradation that can ramp up when we're exercising. Anything else on that degradation side of the spectrum that we want to do to regulate that? Where my head goes is autophagy and fasting, and that can be a way of helping regulate cells that are no longer functioning optimally.
Yeah.
So when it comes to this continuum again, when we're talking about muscle, anything we need to do on the degradation realm other than the exercise itself?
Yeah. So I'll soapbox a little bit here, because I think that there's been for a long time, it was all about improving net balance. And so getting synthesis to be chronically better than or higher than degradation. And you can certainly see that then the muscle gets bigger and bigger. And so we tried to contrive a number of nutritional strategies that would inhibit breakdown, at least acutely, the way that we could measure it. And everybody said, look, that's better. You get better net balance. And when you think about that, it's kind of like not taking out the trash, right? It's letting the bad bricks in the wall accumulate and, not taking them out. And so what's good about that? I mean, you're just putting new bricks in, but there's a crappy part of the wall that the bricks need to come out. That's the degradation, and it's not happening. So, and there are actually several diseases that are, dystrophies that are related to an inhibition of protein breakdown. So you need it to happen. And in fact, the better scenario is that you're turning over the wall fairly rapidly and you're just tilting the balance in favor of synthesis. So, that was the old school view. And, we don't want to do that. In no circumstance do we want to block or inhibit or in any way, actually, I think, impede breakdown, unless you're really sick and you're in something like an intensive care unit. And there, all bets are off, because you're wasting on a scale that, you will never lose muscle mass as fast in your life. So hopefully that doesn't apply to too many people listening. But if you've ever been in an ICU or you've seen somebody go in and come out, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Fast forward, maybe about a couple of decades, and then everybody sort of, the buzzword is autophagy, and we're now talking about one of the main processes that is regulating protein breakdown in the cell. And actually, lo and behold, extended fasts are good, because they upregulate autophagy, and in a sense, then it's like you're cleaning out the garbage. You're taking out damaged proteins. Maybe they're oxidized. Maybe they're misfolded. Maybe they're, there's something wrong with them to the degree that, we're going to break them down. And it kind of, if you like my analogy, is it tightens up the whole system. So now the system's turning things over very, very rapidly. The key is then you still, unless you want to, practice intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding or put yourself in a permanently negative energy balance, you don't want to tip the scale in the opposite direction and lose muscle mass, unless that's a goal. Some people in weight loss are completely happy with losing muscle. But, from my perspective, it's a good thing for a limited period of time. And even the people that sort of advance protein restriction or low protein diets and enhancing autophagy as a theory of sort of clearing out cellular debris or essentially, like I said, getting rid of the garbage, are now saying, well, you need a period of refeeding afterwards. And, I think that that's probably smart. You need to allow the system to recover and bounce back and not push it so deep. So there's some nuance to the argument about why you would do something to upregulate breakdown. I think you can do it for a limited period of time and it has benefits. I don't think a lifetime of doing it does a lot. And I'm basing that on nothing other than we don't have any data in people. We have lots of data in rodents. And it definitely extends lifespan. I'm just not sure that translates over to humans who are genetically outbred as opposed to the inbred strains of animals that are used. And we don't live in controlled environments with no environmental pathogens and lots of other things that make me very skeptical about rodent studies. So,
are you somebody who practices intermittent fasting?
I think I do it, but I don't think I ever thought that it was intermittent fasting. I mean, for me, I do it almost every day, right? Say, the first thing I do, I get up in the morning and I'll have an espresso, probably a double espresso, and there's no sugar in it. It's just slam, get the coffee, and I can sit down. I'm my most productive first thing in the morning. So, and then I exercise. I get my workout in. So it's probably since I've eaten my last meal, because I go to bed, I wake up early, so I go to bed pretty early. It's probably close to, it's at least 12 hours. It's maybe even 14 before I eat another meal. So, my sense is that that's a form of time-restricted eating, but I never really thought I was doing that until I sort of read a little bit more. But then I have a royal breakfast. I have a good breakfast. So it's my favorite meal of the day. So I guess I do it, but I don't do like a 5 and 2 or some other schemes that people do. It doesn't really work for me, to be honest with you. I do like to eat.
Well, let's take that even further and talk about that first meal. How much protein do you like to get? And what would that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the game changer for me for the breakfast meal, which for a long time was always a protein shake or a smoothie, has been Greek style yogurt or skyr. Because first, it's a great source of protein. Second, I like the taste, and third, it's got all kinds of other benefits, not the least of which is a probiotic load, which, unless you're trying to change that, really doesn't change unless you do something. And I've learned from walking across campus and going to my medical school rounds, which, the hospital specializes in pediatrics and gastroenterology. So every other week I learn something about the microbiome and, what bacteria are good and all kinds of things. And so the dirty secret is you got to keep doing whatever it is that's changing your microbiotic composition. You can't take a week off and just let it sit there. Then it changes again. So it's generally about, if I were to ballpark it, it's probably about 45 grams of protein. And I don't have a hard time getting up to that type of dose, just given the amount that I eat and everything else. But it's got fruit in there as well. It generally has another coffee. And it's got some sort of cereal grain in there just to, mix in. Sometimes there's milk, sometimes it's kefir, sometimes there's protein powder, sometimes there's not. It's just how I feel. And but it's about 45 grams.
If you're enjoying this episode, take a second and let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much. And now back to the show. Let's talk about why 45 grams. What's happening in the body physiology-wise? Is that a specific number you've come to that you try and aim for because of the physiology? Or is that just... Talk about the nuance there.
No, I don't think it's not a target. No, I think it would be fair to say that there's, I don't know if the debate is raging, but there's definitely some discussion out there right now about the dose of protein. And so I think our group have inadvertently contributed to the notion that, and people say this all the time, and it's wrong, So they say, oh, well, Phillips group, and then, his buddy Kevin Tipton and Ollie Whittard and a few others, they showed that you can only absorb 20 grams of protein. And I'm like, nobody ever said that. So you can absorb a ton of protein, so just get that out there. But we showed that, 20 grams of protein appears to maximize muscle protein synthesis. So I was always like, we should get at least 20 grams of protein. If you're bigger, you probably need more. If you're smaller, you probably need less. And, we thought the argument was pretty much settled. Oliver Whittard and Kevin Tipton, exactly the same finding. There's another paper, McNaughton, who found maybe a little bit better with 40 grams than 20 grams, but the difference is about 15% in muscle protein synthesis. So maybe that's why I aim for 45. But no, I don't. I have no rationale for that. But, recently, again, my friend, colleague, Luc Van Loon, and a PhD student, well, actually, he's not a PhD student anymore. He's a postdoc, Jorn Tromelin, did a study where they fed people 100 grams of protein and showed a better response than 25 grams of protein. So, it puts to bed the myth, which nobody, and least of all us, said, you can't absorb only this. How much you can use is really the question. And, they showed, I think, pretty conclusively that you can absorb a lot more. And second, that you can make use of it. And for longer as well, which is, it's kind of interesting. So let's just say I don't really aim for that. That's kind of, what I get. Some days I think it's more, other days I think it's less, but it's easily hitting a 30-gram threshold almost every day.
And would it be fair to say that hitting that 30 grams would be a baseline that the average adult would want to shoot for? We're going to get into a lot of the nuances here over, a 12-hour period, a 24-hour period. But that first meal of the day, depending who you talk to, there is a lot of importance put on getting that protein bolus. And that's what I'm trying to pick out here.
Yeah.
Should your average adult aim for 20, 30 grams? Or as we broaden out this conversation, is it more just within that 12 hours, 24 hours?
So I think the first meal is important. And let's be clear, like with very few exceptions, and I can't even really think it. So there's only a few people that do these experiments. Our group is one, Luc Van Loon's group, Phil Atherton's group in the UK, Blake Rasmussen, and a few other people maybe. But, that's kind of it, right? And I know all of those people, and we present at conferences, and we're friends, we're good friends. So no animosity at all. Almost everybody does their experiments in an overnight fasted state because it's the easiest way to control conditions. Not always. Like Luke's group has done some evening feeding stuff. So let's say it's always a first meal phenomenon. Like it's always a breakfast meal that we're talking about because, it's the first thing that these people eat. And it's generally isolated protein as well. So let's be clear about that. It's not, it's not scrambled eggs and bacon. It's whey or soy or milk protein or these sorts of things. So, but I do think that first meal is important. And I think Don Lehman, another good friend of mine, would sort of, and he's the person that primed me on this concept, would sort of say, that's when the system is most sensitive because you've just fasted usually for at least 10 hours, something like that, maybe shorter, maybe longer, is most sensitive to the provision of protein. And you kind of kickstart and pattern the process. He figures, and he may be right on this, is that actually the lunchtime meal is that if you get protein synthesis, it goes up and then it's starting to come down. The lunchtime meal just sort of bumps it a little bit, but it's nowhere near the degree of stimulation that the first meal gives you. It could be that third meal, usually dinner time, which is where for North Americans you get most of your protein, you get another bump. And that sort of bump continues for quite some time, depending on how much protein that you consume. But then the bigger picture, when you zoom out from looking at protein synthesis and just look at, muscle and lean mass gain, suggests that some of these more nuanced details that we talk about, meal to meal distribution, a few other things, are maybe far less important than just getting, 3 times 30 grams, or, if you want like round numbers, and they're not round, but 1.6 grams per kilo or zero 0.7 grams per pound, in a day. And it doesn't really matter how you eat it. You can eat it maybe, as if Jorn's work is generalizable, as one big meal, and not as, 3 small meals, which I would have said prior to Jorn's study would have been more optimal. But nobody's tested that. Nobody's tested the 1 big versus 3. We've done some iterations of that, and we do find 3's generally better than a few bigger ones, but 6 smaller ones isn't as good as 3 sort of medium-sized ones. But the differences are small. I'd be fair, I think, to say.
All right, there's a lot of nuance there, but getting practical for the adult who wants to build or maintain muscle, say a middle-aged adult, given where the research is right now, would you recommend to them having a breakfast with a certain amount of protein to, again, coming back to our brick wall analogy, to kick off MPS early on in the day and start bringing those bricks into the wall?
Yeah. No, I think it's a solid strategy. And I also think, too, is it's sort of, I think one of Don's arguments is it kind of patterns everything for the day. And I do think that first meal, like, it's kind of a missed opportunity because, if the second meal, like, isn't a big bump in protein synthesis, you miss the opportunity if you have a small amount of protein. And like, I can tell you for a fact, I mean, I'm the director of a center. It's 2 floors down from here, but where when we've looked at older women, so on average, they'd be about sort of high 60s, low 70s years old. They get about 8 grams of protein on average at breakfast, and most of it is from wheat gluten. So it's a poor quality source protein, and that's a missed opportunity to do something for your muscle for sure. So I don't know where middle-aged is anymore. So let's just say that it could be somewhere around 58 or something like that. If you were a 58-year-old, something like me, then you should be aiming for, I'd say at least 30 grams at breakfast would be a good habit.
Let's talk about that woman hypothetically taking in only 8 grams in the morning.
Yeah.
They're not going to likely stimulate MPS.
Yeah.
Take me through the physiology there. Say that's all they have at breakfast. They go through to lunch. Say they're, again, just picking at things and getting 15 grams of protein.
Right.
Let's talk about worst case scenario and what happens when people aren't getting that bolus of protein and they're really not activating MPS.
Yeah, and I can speak to this from even a little bit less than a theoretical level, because we have some data that's basically being analyzed right now, postdoc of mine, and it's pretty shocking how small amounts of protein. It might say 10 grams, and you say, "Oh, it's 10 grams of protein." Like when you look, and it's mixed sources, so real meals, these are real meals now, it doesn't even budge the needle in terms of blood amino acid levels. Like, they don't even go up. And so it really does speak a little bit to the fact that, the isolated protein sources, first, we're always exaggerating the response versus a mixed meal, which is a little bit less. And something around 10 grams of protein of mixed sources is a pretty poor stimulator if it stimulates muscle protein synthesis, like, at all. So I think you might offset breakdown a little bit, which is okay, but it doesn't really give you the anabolic response that you want to kind of continue to preserve muscle mass in those women. They'd obviously be on the sort of the downslope of sarcopenia. So, the long and short is, if it's 8 grams at breakfast, 15 grams at lunch, maybe it's 30 grams at the dinner time meal. Dinner may be the only time where they even get a little bit of a bump. And if Don's theory about the first, second, third meal phenomenon is there, that's not much. So you haven't hit that threshold, or you have maybe you've come close once, or you've hit it once, and you're good then. But that's not the way to optimize the preservation of muscle or the gaining of muscle if you're going in the opposite direction.
Then to get into some more nuance on our hypothetical, there's the two different inputs that we talked about that stimulate MPS. Say that woman is doing resistance training. How is that going to impact, say, again, as a thought experiment, she's still having very low protein dietarily, but she's stimulating muscle and stimulating MPS that way. Is it kind of, do we bring both of those together to have that threshold reached, diet and exercise?
Yeah. So, right off the bat, first thing, if you're lifting weights, you're doing something really good for yourself. So don't want to discourage anybody from doing that, or say if you're not doing the protein distribution, you're not getting that right, that resistance exercise is resistance is futile, to use the phrase. It's not. Like, it's got lots of benefits. You get a lot stronger. It's good for your muscles. It's good for your tendon. It's good for your bone. It's good for your general health otherwise. They're synergistic in the way they work. Exercise makes muscles more sensitive to protein, and so you build more. The hard part to acknowledge is, as you get older, there's a phenomenon known as anabolic resistance. And so that sensitization of muscle as a result of resistance exercise just doesn't happen to the same degree as it did when you were younger. And it has some parallels with insulin sensitivity. If people understand that concept, is that, a given amount of glucose elicits a given amount of insulin response, and then you get a given amount of uptake of the glucose into muscle. Same principle, except maybe a little bit less driven by insulin, and a given amount of protein gives you a given amount of amino acids. And instead of them efficiently going into the muscle and replacing those damaged bricks in the wall, they don't get in. They just can't get into the muscle. Or if they get in, they're not used as efficiently at repairing the wall. And so, that's anabolic resistance. Or you digest less of the protein. And so that could be where the barrier is with older people. So, your hypothetical, theoretical woman is still doing something good for herself. Very good. But she's probably not getting all of the benefit that she could if she had the protein dialed in and evenly distributed, or she was getting that, amount that we talked about earlier across the day.
Coming back to anabolic resistance, as people age, is that affecting both inputs, the diet and the exercise? Do people as they age need to ramp up in both of those? Talk about the specifics there.
Yeah, probably yes. Both do tend to go down, for reasons that aren't fully clear, but you get less of an anabolic response to exercise, and you get less of an anabolic response to protein. So the theory is that you can make up by eating a bit more protein, and I definitely think that 1.6 grams per kilogram, 0.7 grams per pound that's a generic recommendation that's good. Doesn't matter whether you're younger or older. From the exercise standpoint, you could argue that, you need to do more, or you need to do more intense work or anything. The hard part to overcome is that as you get older, that gets harder and it hurts. So, and that's not because of the soft tissue response. Muscles are actually pretty good at repairing themselves or whatever, but the connective tissue response, the tendons, ligaments, cartilage is, that stuff just, it wears out. It's got a poor blood supply, and we just can't make it and renew it as well as we did when we were younger. So I think it's harder as you age, and at some point, the mechanism just begins to tip, and sarcopenia begins. I think in earnest, if we compare the average 50-year-old that's out there to the average 30-year-old. We could, if we had enough people, say that they're already suffering from sarcopenia. They're already losing muscle. They're weaker. There are some activities, maybe not that they can't do, but that they take a longer time to do, that they struggle to do, or that they modify the way that they do them to include an assist, because they know that without the assist they couldn't do it. And and when people say, "What do you mean by an assist?" I'm like, well, they definitely need to hold on to a handrail when they descend a flight of stairs that's 10 feet wide. There's no way they would go down the middle of it, because they know that they're maybe not strong enough to do it. When they get into some car, they have to hold on to the handle because they don't have the leg strength to lever themselves in. Some, there's small things, and subtle, but they're a sign. When you resistance train, and you slow that down to the point that it's imperceptible at age 50. Into your 60s, I think you're going to start to see touches of it. I'd be surprised if there's anybody in their 70s that can say that they operate as well as they did in their 30s, but there's a few freaks out there, so never say never. But it's all about changing the trajectory of that downward curve with respect to anabolic resistance and pushing back as much as you can.
Again, coming back to our two inputs, exercise and protein intake, talk about where somebody needs to really consider those and start optimizing those. Early in the conversation, you mentioned the hormonal benefits somebody would get at a younger age. When does that start to decline? And when should somebody start to be more cognizant of what we're talking about today to make sure that they're optimizing for at least maintaining, if not building, muscle mass?
There's probably a few considerations. I mean, the growth aspect of, when you're growing and being a kid, for most of us, growth stops at 18, 19 at the most. I think we enjoy a heyday in our early and mid 20s where, the machine is still fired up. You might not be growing as much, but man, you can put a lot of calories in the machine. And if you're a pretty active person, it's like, you don't gain weight at all. Like you just burn that stuff off. And then something slows down. Probably you do less. I mean, everything as it ages does less. Earthworms, people, it just happens. Dogs, cats, everything. And, that's probably part of the equation. But the hormonal benefit is essentially the anabolic drive from a hormonal perspective is not lost, but it's definitely almost gone. And so now you have to really dial in. I mean, I think the big answer is that the most important of the two, not that diet is unimportant, but the far more important of the two to maintain muscle and fitness and, optimize, as you said, your chances is activity and exercise. So, keep those up and don't let them. Usually people, there are phases in people's lives where they kind of give up on activity. So, going from middle school to high school, a lot of girls just drop out of, they might do the mandatory, I think it's 1 or 2 years of phys ed, and then they're not physically active, like pretty much again, like that's it. From high school to, if you go to college, is another big one where people drop out of activity programs. People get married, have kids. It's another, boom, it's a big drop. And how do you find time, et cetera? So, it's about realizing some of those transitions are probably natural points where you need to make physical activity a priority and not let it not be a part of your life, or build it into other activities that you do and, realize that you're still being physically active, but you maybe not are hitting the gym. But at a certain point, I want to say probably in your late 40s, early 50s, you begin to realize that you're definitely weaker. You definitely don't have the endurance. And that maybe there's a few things that you're going to have a harder time doing. And, so if you wanted to, is there a turning point? I'd say, there's no turning point. You should probably be doing it the whole time. But somewhere in your late 40s, if you're not making a switch, if you weren't active before, or if you were doing some, but not a lot, you might want to think about doing a little bit more and making a little bit more structure and figuring out A, some things you enjoy, and then B, some things that you can stick to, and things get a whole lot better.
Given the fact that there are these two different inputs, how much leeway do we have between leaning into one versus the other at different phases of life? And where my head goes as I bring that up is the extreme. If somebody's bedridden because they have some kind of traumatic injury, but we could even come back to what you're just talking about there. Different phases of life is going to allow for different amounts of physical activity. So we'll start with the diet piece. Somebody who, for whatever reason, isn't moving their body, they're not getting that input. Can they up their protein or just maintaining protein to the level we're talking about today to still get MPS stimulated? How much of it needs to come from the exercise as well? And then I want to hit it from the other side, somebody that's not cognizant of their protein. And this ties back kind of to what we talked about before, the woman who's not hitting her protein goals, but is doing resistance training. But let's talk about it from both those aspects and get into some nuance here.
Okay. So my rider statement right off the bat is in this discussion, because I've kind of, mashed this out on social media and taken my licks, is that we're going to take the focus off of, we're going to take off the myopic lens that everything in life is about weight loss or weight gain. Okay. And we're going to just talk about muscle. So that from that perspective, exercise is hands down the behavior that you need to adopt. And so if you eat ultra processed food, you go to McDonald's and all this sort of stuff. And I'm not saying that's the extreme, of course, and everybody, oh, that's terrible. And it is, it's not good. Don't get me wrong. But, and you are an active person, you're going to be much better off than somebody who's inactive and follows all of the protein recommendations and et cetera, et cetera. Put them both together, you're way better off. Don't get me wrong. But the hands down winner from a health standpoint, from a muscle standpoint, and, like I said, weight loss out of the question because that's energy balance. And, a few people think it's carbohydrates and insulin, but whatever. Exercise is the health behavior that you need to adopt. Now, if you're overweight, it's entirely different. If you're overweight and flat out weight is lost in the kitchen or through your diet, but muscles and fitness are made in the gym. And when you look at all of the sum total, I think of the evidence, most of it observational, I'll admit, but in both directions. The risk ratios for people who are physically active in terms of all, and I mean all major metabolic, cardiometabolic, as well as 13 out of 26 most common types of cancers, you have a lower risk the more active you are. There's probably a dose response. We know that for sure. You can't even touch the degree of risk reduction with just about any dietary intervention, maybe barring a few sort of lipid issues and heart disease and pre-existing risk, et cetera. You can, you do yourself some good by eating well, no question about it. But the physical activity aspect of things is really the core. And I know I'll probably upset a lot of people by saying that, but the best of all worlds, which generally describes a lot of people that argue that one or the other is important, is to do both, or to do both to the degree that you can. There's a lot of talk right now about alcohol. Is it good for you? Is it bad for you? And everything. And I don't know about you, but I do like to have a beer, a glass of wine. I don't drink a lot. In fact, compared to my former self, I'm almost a teetotaler, but do like to have a glass every now and again. But so maybe in doing so, I'm shaving part of my lifespan or my health span off or whatever. But I do it in the context of sitting down with my family, my friends, and I think I don't know. I think this is a pretty good scenario to enjoy a social drink. So, what's my justification for doing that? Well, I don't know. Maybe that's why I exercise, is that I can, exercise forgives a lot of sins. And I know people have credited me with that phrase. It's not mine. I think I stole it from Mike Joyner, who's a friend of mine. Like all good things, they're ripped off from somebody else. But it really does. Like, you can even be a smoker. And so to give you the most extreme, there's a habit that, if you're doing it, like, your risks for, everything blows up. But if you're a smoker and you're active, and I get it, there's not a lot of active smokers, but if you are, you're even at a lower risk than somebody who smokes and does nothing. So if exercise, and there's no dietary intervention that can do that. So I think it's exercise if we're going to really lean into one.
For somebody middle-aged right now, and say they haven't been exercising, or at least regularly, let's give them a plan, because there are so many different types of exercise, intensities. If they just want to maintain and maybe build a little bit of muscle, what do they need to do?
Yeah. I think that there's a few things. First, behavior change, particularly when it comes to lifestyle, is just, flat out say it's difficult, particularly if you are middle-aged. So you're, 40s, 50s, we'll call that middle-aged. It's difficult. And particularly when it comes, I think, to a form of exercise that a lot of people, first, we know from self-report anyway, most people, about 70% of probably the US and Canadian population, do not do any form of strengthening activity. And that's not lifting weights, that's strengthening activities. So engaging in yoga, Pilates, and lots of other things that they're strengthening for sure, but they're not weightlifting and progressive overload that I would call strengthening activity. But so you got to find something you enjoy, and you got to find something that motivates you on some level to continue doing. Those are, a lot of discussions on social media about lift lighter, lift lower, lift this, lift that. And I'm like, how about we get the 70% lifting? That would be a huge, from a public health standpoint, huge change. And so I'm like, let's just find something you can do and you come back to doing. And I think that's crucial, right? Opportunity. Do you have a gym nearby? Do you have something nearby? Do you do it alone? Do you like working alone, or do you prefer to work in groups? Do you have the means to afford a personal trainer? If not, is there a Y close by? If you don't have the financial means, can you afford $50 to get a set of resistance bands? Because, programs show that they work. They're not going to, you're not going to climb onto the podium in Paris, but you're going to get stronger if you're able to do this and do it consistently. So try and find the intrinsic motivation that pushes a button that says to you that this is, because most people cite they don't have time. I think actually the real speak behind that is, I don't value this activity enough to make the time to do it. And I think that's a a nuanced maybe difference between I don't have time, but it's and I think that's easy. It's an even easier excuse, if that's what you want to call it, for somebody to not lift weights than for somebody, because everybody, you say, go get some more exercise, and so you just walk out your front door. That's easy, right? And again, walking is great. Like, awesome, great activity. But if you want to get stronger, and I do think as you get older, you're going to be limited eventually by your strength. And if not your strength, like your power, your ability to, be strong and do it. And it's getting out of a chair is the ultimate lift, right? Once you can't do that, you're looking at full-time institutionalized care or a lot of support around you to help you with your activities of daily living. So find something you enjoy. That's the biggest thing, I think.
When it comes to power, Is that something that people are going to gain naturally just by resistance training, or is there specific exercises we want to do?
You probably gain a little bit of it as you get stronger, just because, power incorporates force and strength. But the timing part, like doing it fast, does require a little bit of focusing on doing things relatively rapidly. As soon as you introduce, velocity of movement into an equation, there's a safety aspect that comes along with that. But if you talk to older people, it's interesting how quickly they grasp the slowness or the quickness of the activity. They generally think about it in terms of how fast they walk. And they know, I just don't move as fast. And when you begin to train them, and even if you train them in fast walking, as an example, they get that pretty quickly. And so you can train them pretty quickly to be able to understand that it's the speed of how doing things that is maybe a little bit more important than big loads and trying to, press, 100 pounds over your head. But if you can take 10 pounds and a broomstick and you can push it over your head, but you can do it fast, that's probably a better form of practice for them.
You mentioned the exercise bands, and obviously that's really a low barrier to entry for most people. You can order them on Amazon. Cost is relatively low. But I want to try and go even lower than that. For the person that's not doing any resistance training right now, to get them in the habit, to get them moving and building strength and building muscle, what's the easiest, say, 3 to 5 exercises they can do at home just using their body weight? Just air squats, maybe push-ups, things like that they can build off of over time, but just to get them started here.
Sure. So it's 5. There's really only 3 types of exercises. There's pushing. So you're pushing something away from you. You're either doing it laying on your back, and that's traditional bench. I do prefer the older people, at least, because very rarely do I find myself on my back and trying to push something off it. But this sort of thing. And pushing over your head. So there's a seated press and an overhead press. There's a pulling exercise. Generally, I do like the arms above the head and pulling down. So in other words, a lat pull down, or while you're seated and pulling something towards you. And you can easily mimic those sorts of things, I think, with bands or with things around the house. If you have a towel, even. And then, as you said, like an air squat, right? So it's a body weight squat. You're getting up and you're going down to sort of a comfortable level. I don't need, ass to the grass. I don't need, crunching your basically full coverage of your hamstring over your calf. I don't need that. But, that's it, right? And if you can do those and cross your arms across your chest, get up and out of a chair, try it 5 times. The next time, can you do 6? Can you do 7? Can you do 8? Can you do, et cetera, progress that way.
Well, let's come back to our muscle physiology and talk about somebody doing an air squat and bring in the MPS and muscle protein breakdown. What's happening while they're doing that, afterwards? And then I want to get into the nuance of providing the bricks at the right time to build that muscle up.
Yeah, I don't know, kind of think before I do answer this question. We do know, it's actually he's a former postdoc of mine, a guy named Lee Breen over in the UK, whose group did some work using bands. So I couldn't tell you about body weight stuff, but there are a few, I think, exercises or studies that have sort of used body weight and that sort of thing. It's just about working to a high level of effort. I use, people's ability to perceive effort as a good external indicator of how hard you're working. And so everybody understands effort, I think, at a sort of a global level of, it doesn't require sweat or everything, but if you're doing a push-up, or a squat, you do it to the point where you think, I could probably do 1 or 2 more here, but if I do, I might fail. I might get fatigued. I might fall over. I might make it not safe. I might, hurt something or another. so I'm going to stop. But I've just exerted myself, and maybe on a scale out of 10, where 10 out of 10 is like red and that's maximal, I'm at a 9. And that almost certainly will turn on muscle protein synthesis. So it will increase the rate at which bricks go into the wall or back into the wall. I mean, I think, remembering that turnover concept, if breakdown is pulling old bricks out, we can actually recycle them and put them back in the wall. And in fact, we do that relatively efficiently. When we're young, we do it extraordinarily efficiently. When we're older, not quite so. But the point is, you're improving the recycling of those bricks. And so before we talk about provision of exogenous protein and stimulating more bricks going in, I think that's pretty clear. That'll happen, no question about it.
To understand the physiology a little bit more, what if somebody isn't providing protein through the diet and they're exercising and not providing the bricks? You mentioned the recycled bricks. What will the body do in that case? Is it going to pull from muscle and you're going to start losing protein from the muscle at that point? Or how does the body respond when it's not provided the raw materials for MPS?
So the thought experiment is, you just imagine you have somebody and all they're doing is lifting weights and they're not eating, right? And I mean, it's an odd scenario to think about, but I mean, all it would do is, so compared to somebody who was not eating and not lifting weights, they would lose muscle very fast. The person who was lifting weights would lose muscle, but much slower. So you're hanging on to more of your muscle when you're lifting weights than you are if you're, not lifting weights, and protein is ruled out of the equation. So, I think you can sort of take that one to the bank and say, but the best you could do would be 100% recycling and absolute, 100% conservation of all the bricks that came out, all got put back into the wall. And we know that doesn't happen. So you're going to lose some muscle, but you're going to lose it far slower than somebody who's not lifting weights. Again, to the point of, if you could pick something to do, what would it be? And it would definitely be exercise over trying to tweak the diet, which is, it's a more subtle arrangement of the equation, so to speak.
One of the things you hear is when you start losing muscle, you can't rebuild that or regain that. You can only maintain what you still have at that point.
Yeah.
Is there any truth to that?
So I think one of the scenarios that we've sort of championed that I think is a threshold moment for older people is this disuse event. And when people say, what are you talking about? And I mean, so we use the term disuse to refer to when we immobilize a muscle. So we put it's not a cast, but we might put a brace on someone's leg as if they've just torn their ACL. And so it takes the weight off of the leg, they crutch around, and their leg atrophies, and it atrophies fairly rapidly. The difference is if you're a younger person and you take the brace off, and I don't do any sort of rehab at all, you just, go back to walking around, you regain the muscle. If you're an older person, and we did the same experiment, and we've done a few of these experiments, they don't gain the muscle back. You have to work very, very hard to gain that muscle back. You have to go into the gym and lift weights. You just don't get it back. So I think that maybe that's the scenario that people think, like, I don't know about the maintenance part. Like, you're definitely, at some point you're on the downslope. There's no question. And it's the difference between, the slope like this or this a steep slope versus a shallow slope. But if you have that disuse event, it's a rapid decline. So, forget about the brace on the leg, or you fracture your leg or your arm or whatever. But going into hospital and getting sick and spending 3 or 4 days, even 5 days in bed, as an older person, you lose a lot of muscle. More so than a younger person, and more so as a percentage of the muscle that you had because you've got less. And then the difference is on the backside of that event, you leave the hospital because you're well, but there's no attempt made to rehabilitate you from your bed rest event and, pull you back to where you were before. If you're a young person, no sweat. You just do what you do, or maybe you do go to the gym or you do a few things and the muscle comes back, and so does the strength. It might take a while, but it comes back. As an older person, it generally represents a permanent loss. It's gone. It's very hard to get it back unless you work very hard. And the very hard, prescription on the backside of just being sick in hospital is, for the most part, pretty minimal.
This kind of ties back to something I brought up before in your example there of being in the hospital. Somebody tuned in to what we're talking about today and say they're middle-aged and they break a leg and they know that they're going to be in the hospital for a couple of weeks and not moving. What would you do personally in that case, dietary-wise, to try and preserve best you can?
So we have a phrase that runs around the lab, is that it's hard to out-diet inactivity. You have a hard time, dieting your way out of not being active. Like it's just difficult. And it's even a tougher proposition to out-diet or nutrition your way out of preventing muscle loss. But there's a few, and I think they're pretty fine-grained things that you could do. First, it's higher quality protein, and by quality we're talking about the content of 9 of the 20 bricks that are essential. We call them essential amino acids. One in particular, and that's leucine as an amino acid. Probably creatine could help. So as a supplement. And high dose omega-3s, which, again, this was a former postdoc of mine, and he came in and convinced me that we needed to give people omega-3s because they got into the muscle. And it really wasn't my thing. I'll be honest. I was like, okay, sure. Let's try an experiment. And when we did it in young women, not completely, that's not true. It halved the amount of atrophy that these young women saw. But they got to take the omega-3s before they went in, and we put the brace on their leg. So if you don't know you're going to break your leg, right, then you better be taking some omega-3s. But if you break your leg, then I'd be prescribing you some high dose omega-3s and trying to prevent as much atrophy as I could. And I would be the complete pain in the butt for probably the nurses station, because I'd be the person trying to, get on my crutches and get out of the bed and, do all the things that, and there's a lot of reasons for this. Nurses just don't they don't want to lose control of the patient and not know where the patient is. Right. So it's because they're charting and it's like, where's that, where they gone again. Right. So that's a concern if you're older, because you could fall, but when you're younger, maybe not as much. But if you get the right people, then I'd get on my horse and I'd be as active as I could in the hospital.
Expand more on the creatine piece outside of this special case scenario for muscle health and building muscle, and for the mental aspect as well.
Well, I have a short supplement shelf, but it includes creatine. I don't know that it does much for me from a muscle standpoint. I'm kind of hoping it might, but I feel good when I take it. But I take it more for what it might do cognitively. This is, sort of a really novice area of research that the effects right now, being completely honest, I think they're pretty small. But the studies are small, and I don't know that we've got the right outcomes. But your brain stores creatine as well as your muscle does. And, energy crises in your brain are actually, one of the key parts of lots of syndromes of dementia and cognitive impairment are due to declines in the ability of your brain to energetically produce the ATP it needs. Sort of like your muscle needs the same ATP to generate force, your brain needs ATP to continue to work. So phosphocreatine, high energy store, creatine, the precursor to it, your brain stores it. We've got animal data that shows that, people who get traumatic brain injuries or certain syndromes and we get, a stroke or something like that, these animals do a lot better when they're on creatine. And so I'm kind of banking on some of that rubbing off because the main reason people go, oh, like, what, the effect's so small or whatever. And I'm like, so what other things do we have that, lower the risk for dementia and everything, And they're like, well, I don't know, exercise. I'm like, oh, I'm already doing that. And it's like good diet. I'm like, oh, I'm pretty sure I got most of that dialed in. And I'm like, this is, we don't have drugs. We don't have a preventive drug. And we don't even have a good treatment drug out there. You get diagnosed with dementia. And a lot of it is just like, so, here's a pamphlet for you. Here's a pamphlet for your caregiver. Come back in a year and let's see, we do another cognitive test and I'll tell you how good you're doing or not doing. And, here's something on sleep. Here's something on, if they're progressive enough, here's something on activity and diet. And I hope it goes well for you. We got a couple of drugs out there. They're pretty crummy and they slow the decline. But even there, exercise, pretty impressive in terms of the effects it has. Exercise is not a cure, right? But it reduces your risk tremendously. And even if you have dementia, reduces the rate of decline pretty substantially too. So
when it comes to creatine dosage, are you a fan of loading, maintaining with a certain dose, cycling on and off? How do you look at all that?
Low dose, like 3 to 5 grams a day, every day. Just a scoop. Generally goes into the yogurt in the morning. I didn't mention that. Should have mentioned that. But yeah, that's where it goes. I mean, I think the loading protocols, if you went all the way back, and I'm old enough to remember when creatine wasn't a supplement, and Eric Holtman and Roger Harris and a few others, we're starting to get into this stuff, and they thought these were the same guys. Eric Holtman worked with Jonas Bergstrom, who made the needle that we take muscle pieces with, right? And so maybe he thought the glycogen loading, which kind of came from those guys as well, was the same thing with the creatine loading. And so the doses that they were prescribing back then were way over what was needed. And so a ton of creatine would appear in the urine of individuals that did those doses. So I don't think that's necessary. I think most people now, it's sort of 3 to 5 grams a day, and you can build stores up if you respond, because not everybody responds to creatine, and you're good from there. Cycle on and off. If I miss a day or two, or if I go on holiday and don't bring my supplemental creatine, I'm okay. It's all good. I know it's going to be there when I come back. Some people, they see it differently, and I get it, but I don't think it's a big deal.
So you mentioned the fact you're not huge into supplements.
Yep.
Omega-3s were mentioned, creatine. Any others that are on the shelf?
Vitamin D. Vitamin D is about it. I live in northern latitude, far enough away from the equator that in wintertime, my sunshine exposure is pretty limited. I think the prevalence data of overt insufficiency, deficiency of vitamin D is enough to make me think that I should take that supplement particularly in winter. I don't worry about it in the summer. I don't get a ton of sun exposure, but enough that I think I'm okay. Once you get beyond, you've brought someone who's deficient to sufficient or insufficient to sufficient, I don't think there's any role for vitamin D in going from, sufficient to, hyper, vitamin D levels. But I do think that you've got to take care of insufficiency or deficiency. And then from a muscle perspective, if not from a bone perspective, and probably lots of other perspectives as well, vitamin D would be my other supplement for sure.
A few minutes back, you got into some specifics around amino acids.
Yeah.
And up until this point, in general, we've been talking about protein as a whole.
Yeah.
But let's get into some of the nuance here with amino acids, quality of protein. Oftentimes, protein is just looked at as a whole, an umbrella term.
Yeah.
You mentioned leucine, the essential amino acids. How do we factor all that in when it comes to dietary protein?
Yeah. So the brick wall again, because it's, it works. It's got 20 bricks in it. 11 of those bricks we can make. We can bake that brick. And when people think about bricks that like they're all the same size and shape and everything, it's not the case in the human body. So the 20 amino acids, the 20 building blocks that we have in protein they're like different shapes, if that's the right way of saying it. One's it's sort of like an interlocking brick, and one's, or maybe they're different colors. I don't know. And we can bake and make 11 of those bricks. 9 of them we can't, and 9 of them we need to get from our diet. So, meat, if we eat it, very rich source of protein, very rich source of essential amino acids. Eggs, dairy. If you want to go to plant, then soy is probably kind of top of the heap. There are, nuts and seeds and legumes and everything else have all of these essential amino acids. I know a lot of people, they go, "Oh, plants are deficient." I'm like, no, we got to stop that. They aren't deficient. They're lower, but they're not deficient. And, when you eat these things, you're bringing in these other 9 bricks. They're essential because if you were stuck on a desert island and you'd imagine that there's a protein source and it only contains the 11 bricks, or it contains 11, and they say 3 of the 9 that we need, eventually you're going to die. Like it take a long time, but we just can't, if we can't make it and we're not eating it, then we don't thrive. So the way I kind of explain it is there's one brick in particular that is not just a substrate for building a wall. It's actually the brick that when it arrives, it's like it turns on the process that says, "Hey, it's time to make the wall." So I kind of, it's the player coach brick. It's a player. It's part of the wall, but it's also the one that goes, "Okay, it's time to build. It's time to make the brick wall here." And so we call that it's a signal. It turns on a signaling pathway or signaling process. And that brick is leucine. It's a branch chain amino acid, which I'm sure probably a lot of your listeners have heard about. And it's the one branch chain of the 3. The other 2, I know everybody talks about the branch chain amino acids. There's 3 of them. There's leucine, isoleucine, and valine. But it's leucine that is the exclusive kind of trigger brick. It gets the whole process started. It makes the process sort of, turn on. And then the analogy I use is it's not like flipping a switch. It's on, it's off. It's like a dimmer switch, though. You get some leucine and the light comes on a little bit. You get more leucine that turns on. And then at a certain point, you can flood the system with leucine and you can try and turn, but you can't make the lights any brighter. So the whole brick wall process is, when the lights are on, it's going, and it's leucine that drives that process.
And how much leucine do we need? And does it need to be within a specific period of time? And what foods contain a good amount of that?
Yeah, I wish I could give you a great answer to how much do we need. There's a few people have tried to do this. We don't really have a great answer. I think Don Lane Norton did some great work with rodents. But in humans, it sort of seems to be that between 2 to 3 grams of leucine per meal is how much we need. And everybody goes, "Well, how much protein is that?" and everything. And the answer is, of course, because it's science, it depends. Because not every protein, as you intimated, is enriched in leucine. And so some proteins are what we call higher quality. So animal source proteins, generically speaking, are higher quality than plant source proteins. And so you need less of them to get that amount of leucine. The highest would come from dairy sources. So milk, yogurt, cheese, that sort of thing. And the highest of the, of all the proteins that we know is whey protein, or a combination of milk proteins, which is whey and casein. But let's just say that probably 10% of all protein in milk is comprised of leucine as a sort of a ballpark estimate. The rest of the protein that's out there, like meat, it would be about 7%, and everything else, eggs, probably about 5 to 6%. Most legumes and soy is about 5 to 6%. So what you really want is, if you had, I'm going to make the math easy so I can do it, at like 100 grams of protein and you had 5%, you get 5 grams of leucine. So you don't need that much. You need probably, let's say, half of that if you were just eating that protein. But within a meal that's enriched, and maybe you've got a glass of milk, then that's 10% by composition leucine. And you've got, maybe there's some eggs in there, then you've got another rich source of leucine, and it all adds up. And because we break these things down into its constituents, and they turn on the process of protein synthesis.
Given the importance of leucine specifically, is it available as a supplement? And any value in taking that with, say, a breakfast, making sure you're hitting that threshold?
It is available as a supplement. It doesn't taste great. It's bitter. We spend time making these things up in the lab because we mess around with these things. You stick your finger and taste all the amino acids, which I know not everybody's done, but believe me, the most bitter of them is leucine. Value, again, the answer is it depends. If you're that low 6 to 8 grams of protein person, there's probably value in taking leucine as a supplement. Not a huge fan of trying to, make up for what food lacks, but it's definitely convenient. But if you're getting, the 30, 40 grams of protein that we talked about per meal, I don't see any advantage to adding leucine to what is probably already a sufficient dose. So I don't think so in that situation. But supplements are definitely convenient. Food first, but not necessarily, supplement free is maybe the way to go.
Well, let's expand out and talk about protein supplements as a whole. You mentioned earlier with your yogurt, adding a protein supplement at least sometimes.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to get one of those, what's the best one to get? And how much can we rely on that to make up for a lack of protein in the diet? Say we're having just like, and again, hypothetical, but just as a thought experiment, somebody having, say, like a cereal really low in protein, but yet they're adding a scoop of protein to their milk and really ramping that up.
Yep.
Does a certain percentage, is what I'm getting at, need to come from the food itself, or can we basically just supplement our way to hitting our threshold?
Yeah. So a lot to unpack in that one, but so first, I don't like to name names, but I'll give you sort of my general guideline for supplements. So particularly protein based supplements. So first, I always say find a brand that is popularly available. So in other words, don't go on the internet and search and find the cheapest one, and it's it takes 3 weeks to get here, and you wonder, like, where's it coming from? Chances are it's not coming from North America. And the risk then for contamination, and when I say contamination, I'm not just talking about, it might have a banned substance in there, which matters if you're going to hop on the podium in Paris, but maybe not for mere mortals. But it doesn't contain what it says it contains. It's got, all kinds of things in there that you just don't want. Like the quality control in the factory is nowhere near as good. So generally I try to say buy domestic, if that's the right way to say things. From that standpoint, then I look for something that bears, it's usually an NSF label that is a quality assurance label. I like stuff that comes from GNC. I think it's a pretty reputable chain. They've got good products in there. They'll tell you the ones that are made in the United States or made in Canada, or and those are the ones that I would buy. More money doesn't mean it's better. It might be that it's got the best advertising and the best reputation or whatever, but you can you can, I hate to say this, but like Costco does a pretty good job. And their protein supplements are good and relatively cheap. So is their creatine, for the record. After that, the question of putting it into the low protein containing meal, I think that's a fine strategy. If you're not willing to kind of choose more food, in other words, I'd sort of preach a food first approach. And the main reason for that is that contained in food are lots of other nutrients that we need anyway. And I'm fond of saying, if you're stuck on a desert island and all you have was protein powder, after a while you'd be dead too. Like, you could get all the amino acids, but you don't have, the calcium, the vitamin D, and all the vitamins that you need that you're getting from other things in your diet, fruits and vegetables and grains and cereals and all kinds of other things. So that's why food is important. I think there's nothing supplement wise. It's really hard to kind of make it all up, and food kind of does it if you eat a varied diet. What it does, though, is get you to the amount of protein that you need. And it does it in a very convenient manner because, protein powders are concentrated, isolated sources of protein. And so they don't contain carbs, they don't contain fats, they're just giving you the protein. And so if energy is an issue for you and you don't want to overconsume energy, then what's wrong with a protein supplement? I don't have any issues with that. I think, hold on, before we go any further, Ryder's statement, protein does not cause your kidneys to fail. It just doesn't. If you want more, if you got show notes, I can add the references for you. We've done several meta-analyses. It does not cause kidney failure. It just doesn't. Doesn't cause your bones to go soft. There's a lot of things out there, but because everybody, that's the first pushback I get. They go, "Oh, doesn't protein cause your kidneys to fail?" I'm like, no, it doesn't do that. Without going any deeper into that one, I'll just give you all the references you like.
Can you talk more about the bone one? Talk about that myth, where that came from, and why that's seeming to hold.
Yeah, it's sort of a golden oldie. You eat some protein. Protein, we'll skip over the details, but makes your blood acidic. Acidic or an acid load in your blood causes calcium to leach from your bones in an attempt to balance the acidity. You lose calcium in your urine and your bones become brittle and weaker. It's called the acid ash hypothesis. So the acid is your blood. The ash is the bone ash, or the calcium that comes out. That's completely false. Actually, when you dial in calcium in terms of an intake and vitamin D for your bone, protein is bone supportive. Because, as I said, if I didn't already, a certain proportion of your bone is actually protein. It's just like, it's not just a stick of chalk, or otherwise bones would break all the time. So I think it's important to realize that you're not going to make your bones brittle or weak by having a higher protein diet. But again, it's still important to get calcium and vitamin D dialed in, because they're the two main bone supportive nutrients for sure.
One of the other things you hear is that protein can impact longevity. And if you're looking to live a long life, you want to decrease your protein intake, which is counter to everything we're talking about today. So speak to that. Is there any truth there in any studies, or where does that come from?
Yeah, so I think the really important part to realize is a lot like the energy restriction trials, which have been done in everything from mice all the way up to primates, so basically monkeys. Everything shows that as soon as you get to sort of primates, the effects are a little bit equivocal. So to be clear, there's no human trial that we can say this causes this in humans. So it's basically observational, and you could make the argument that more protein, then people live shorter, or have more health issues, if that's the right way of saying it. And I think when you dig and I mean really dig around in these data, the answer to that question is very gray. And there's nothing that makes me think that a higher protein diet in the range that we're talking about, and I'm not talking about, all carnivore type diets, which are very different. And that makes me think, there's something there that's shortening somebody's life. Certain nutritional observational studies, higher sources of certain proteins, red meat is the big one, but really nothing that shows that mid or later life or even early life protein consumption shortens life. In fact, a study just came out not too long ago showing that if anything, some forms of protein, plant protein in particular, so it's not the protein per se, maybe it's where it comes from, can actually help you live longer. And I think one of the key parts that, longevity is one thing, right? Living long is one thing. What we're talking about is health span a little bit. So living well. And I've, made the point to several people, I have no interest in living to be 120 and feeling like I'm 120. I might say that I might have a different opinion when I get to that age, if I get to that age. But I'm talking about having full mobility, being able to move around, being, hopefully as disease-free as possible, low medication, basically, running my own show from a cognitive standpoint, and doing as much as I can. So that's health span. And then, the nuance gets even more difficult to say, well, eating more of or less of, without going to sort of extremes, is going to affect your health span. So I don't think that there's nothing, at least in my mind, from a human standpoint, that makes me think that protein, there's something damning about it, that you're going to live, a shorter life, or you're going to experience a downturn in health, particularly, and here's my out statement, which is if you're physically active.
Have you heard of any acute or chronic negative effects from somebody hyperdosing in protein? Say they're eating a lot of meat, they're supplementing with whey, and they're just really upping that protein. Just for completeness, have you seen anything go awry when that happens?
I'm familiar with several people that I've spoken to that not necessarily done research with, but just they say, "Oh, you know something about protein." Well, I'm getting ready for, and it's usually a competition related to physique, bodybuilding, or figure competitiveness or something like that, where people are just doing some diabolical things, and so they're on very low calorie diets. They know that protein can help them maybe hang on to a bit of muscle. They're working out at the same time. And it's hard for me to dissociate the fact that they're eating next to nothing from the fact that they're getting, like, the highest I've seen is somewhere around 6 grams of protein per kilo. And this was in a pretty, I'd call her small, female figure competitor getting ready for a competition. And pretty much all she was eating was protein. And she could barely string a sentence together. But I don't know whether that was because of the protein or she was eating, like, I think it was like, 700 calories a day or something, and was down to some ridiculously low level of body fat. So I don't think anything terrible happens, but it can in those scenarios. It's probably related more to caloric restriction and dehydration and an over obsession with protein. I have talked to a few people that are carnivores, and they seem fine. They seem to thrive. Personally, I just couldn't do that. And I have no intention of trying, but some people, like a lot of, surely what's typified, if we're still around, is our adaptability as a species, right? So I get the feeling that in certain times we can push ourselves into some pretty tight corners and we can be okay and survive. Thriving is a different question. Now, lots of people will say, "I feel fine." And I'm like, maybe you are. But also, Maybe the right stressor hasn't come around and really tested the system. But I've never seen anything too bizarre, but I don't hang around with a lot of people that push themselves into those extremes. So
somebody that wants to accentuate the workouts using a protein powder, any value in taking it in a bottle to the gym and shaking that and drinking it right before a workout, during a workout, right after a workout? Anything whatsoever for people looking for a slight edge?
No, none at all. No, I mean, it's hard for me to say because, of course, I did have the experience, and I'll relate this one. The person shall remain nameless, but one semester I taught a junior level nutrition and metabolism class, and I had a gold medal winner in my class. And this person had just won a gold medal at an Olympics. And so every time I said something and then this person put up their hand, I would call on them and they would relate an anecdote in their preparation up to the Olympics. I lost the room, right? So the anecdote is proportional to the success of the person who gives it. And let's just say is that, so if somebody who wins a gold medal said, well, I took supplement X, I took it to the gym and I slammed it as soon as I was done my workout, then it doesn't matter what I say. So let's just say is that if you're climbing onto the podium in Paris or wherever you are, those last little very nuanced details begin to matter. I think for most mere mortals, the broad strokes matter a little bit more. But if I get a chuckle over anything, it's the sipping on the protein shake during the workout. But generally, not to paint with too broad a brush, you've got an XY chromosome set. It's a guy thing. Women drink water.
How do you feel about using protein, dietary protein, or supplementing the diet as a weight loss strategy? Satiety, thermal effect of protein, any other nuances there that people might want to utilize?
I mean, everything we have on, pure diet induced weight loss. So caloric restriction. So forget about, Ozempic or, whatever, GLP-1 drugs, but protein, there's a small edge. I think it's satiety. I think it's probably the thermic effect. I think it's probably you're hanging on to a bit more muscle. There could be what's called protein leverage. And the idea there is that when you're not consuming enough protein, there's some, I'll call it a protein stat and it's a neural signal that says, go and seek more food because you're not getting enough protein. And so you eat more energy to try and make up for the lower protein. It works well in animals and insects and lots of things. In people, it probably works up to a point, it seems. And then the effects of, sort of going beyond that, usually about 15 to 17% of energy, you don't lever down energy intake. But for all the reasons you just mentioned, I think it's, as a substrate, I think it's the one macro that if people are saying, well, I'm going to restrict energy, what should I focus on? And I think it's a higher relative protein intake and consuming overall less energy. And if you're really bent on, insulin causes fat retention and it's the reason why we're all obese, then restrict simple carbohydrates at the same time and replace it with a little bit of protein. I think that would be a pretty good strategy.
Well, let's tie in metabolic health and go deeper into this piece. Earlier, when we talked about anabolic resistance, you brought up insulin resistance. You just brought up the carbohydrate piece. Yeah. One of the benefits of putting muscle on is the benefits to our metabolic health. Talk about that specific lane and why somebody would want to put on muscle for that specific benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's sort of familiar with the idea of our resting metabolic rate. So, even if you're just laying in bed and doing nothing, we're always burning energy to keep, our heart pumping and all the pumps in our body that consume energy to keep ions and sodium and potassium in check. And, we're still digesting and everything else like that. So, your resting metabolic rate for most people is the largest single energy expenditure you'll have in a day, unless you're a very physically active person. So if you burn a lot of calories through physical activity, then maybe your resting metabolic rate isn't a big consideration. But most of us, have a resting metabolic rate. It's proportional to first our weight, our height, and our sex. So bigger, taller men tend to burn more calories. If you boil resting metabolic rate down to which tissues contribute the most to it, it's really down to two. One is muscle, and it wins by virtue of its mass. You have a lot of it. It's not overly metabolically active unless you're physically active. So if you have more muscle, probably you're more physically active, you tend to burn more energy, and your resting metabolic rate is just notched up a little bit, like the thermostat's, up a little. The other is your liver. It's not very big, but it's hugely metabolically active. And, I often people go, oh, well, we need to do something to our liver. I'm like, no, you don't want to mess with the liver. Nobody's talking about age-related loss of liver unless you're consuming maybe too much alcohol or something. But a lot of people can do something then about age-related loss of muscle mass, and that's to resistance train and to hang on to this metabolically active tissue that is a sink for blood glucose. So it restricts reduces your risk for type 2 diabetes. It's a sink for lipid oxidation. And I have a colleague in Germany, Henning Wackerhage, his name is, and he's sort of the opinion too that we're underestimating a little bit when we begin to lift weights and really sort of turn up the turnover on muscle and maybe create some muscle damage with eccentric type work. That muscle sort of switches its metabolism to be very carbohydrate centric and begin to burn excess carbohydrate. And so it's not just a sink. In other words, it stores glucose. It's sort of a metabolic sink, and it begins to burn and turn the glucose into lots of other things as well. So it's sort of like a tissue that is part of the furnace, and the more of it you have, the level on the furnace is just ramped up a little bit. So to your point, but I point this out to a lot of people too, is this that you have to be active as well, so you're a big muscle person, you can't just lay around. You will burn a little bit more energy, but if you're physically active, that's what really turns the furnace up.
Well, let's take that lying around piece and expand upon it and talk about, and we've talked about being bedridden, but somewhere in between, somebody who is just on vacation, they're not really pushing it. How quickly do we start to lose muscle? Or even overnight, if somebody is, they're not eating after dinner, they're not getting that stimulus through the diet or exercise, how quickly will things start to go the other way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it depends, like most things in science, right? How old you are. And, if you're younger, probably it's not a big deal at all. You spend 2 weeks just sitting around and doing nothing, and it would have no appreciable effect on your muscle at all. We did an experiment several years ago. We took older individuals, and they were overweight, and some of them were obese as well. But they were all metabolically, they had no issues at all. But for 2 weeks, we gave them a pedometer and said, you can't take more than 1,500 steps a day. I think most people now that, you wear something, you've got a ring or something on your wrist, or you've got a phone that tells you how many steps you can take or should take, et cetera, et cetera. And 1,500 is not a lot. So you got to plan your day. You got to, you spend a lot of time sitting around and it's going to cost me 200 steps to, but it was designed to mimic a little bit what happened in hospitalized patients who on average only take about 700 steps. But we thought, well, these people aren't sick. Like we're just going to ask them to sit at home for 2 weeks. They lost muscle in 2 weeks. They got a little bit weaker, but they became insulin resistant. So that may have been the muscle loss, but probably due to the fact they weren't using their muscles as well. and I want to say they were on average, they were about sort of mid 60s. So if you're older, you can lose it pretty quickly. If you completely remove the activity stimulus, and so the bed rest scenario, you lose it very fast. There's been some studies done since trying to rescue that muscle loss in hospitalized patients. Remember, none of these people are sick. These are all well people that we're just saying do less. The overnight scenario, well, that happens every night, right? Unless you're getting up and eating in the middle of the night, which I don't advise. Yeah, I mean, you're very subtly, you're going to lose a small amount of muscle, but nothing on a scale is going to tell you what it is. So every time you eat, you reverse that. So, I mean, I think it's probably self-evident that if you don't eat protein for a long period of time, you're not going to get that stimulation. But similarly, if you don't move around, then you've lost the two inputs that are really driving the system. And as age marches on, the system just gets less and less, capable. The ceiling goes down, but the sensitivity switch is also a little bit dimmed as well. And the only way to ramp that back up, protein helps, but is by being physically active for sure.
Well, where that overnight piece can become maybe even double the length if somebody's not eating after dinner and then fasting in the morning.
Yeah.
You could basically double the length of somebody just, eating relatively close to bedtime and then again in the morning. So there could be a big difference there.
Yeah, I actually, it's interesting that you bring that up. I have a friend reach out to me, and he's never been a big guy. But he said his wife she said, I need to lose some weight. Would you join me in this sort of time restricted eating, intermittent fasting type regime? And he was like, sure, yeah, okay, anything, I'll support you. We're good. And he's a runner, which is awesome, right? But he said, he goes, I didn't find it very hard at all. I goes, I lost some weight, but he goes now, and he said, occasionally I'd be in the gym. He goes, now, I'm weaker. I can feel it. And he goes, he goes, I went from this weight to this weight. And I'm like, no, that's good, but it's not great. So, as you point out, I mean, it probably doesn't take much. And I don't think his running, was overly helpful because it was just, burning off energy. So yeah, and he was never big to begin with, but now he's a much smaller, and even he would acknowledge, sort of weaker version of himself. But that doesn't describe everybody. But to your point, not somebody that really needed to, time restrict their food, but did it to support their spouse, and as a result, lost a little bit of muscle.
And I've heard you talk about having a protein bolus before bed to actually minimize that time and go the other way. Who would you advocate that for?
That's a nuance within a nuance. And I think, if you're an athlete, I think that's a great strategy. If you're an older person, I don't have an issue with that. I mean, I hate to say this, but like the warm glass of milk before you go to bed, maybe it's not a bad idea after all. But a lot of people, it gives me indigestion. I have to get up in the night to go pee, or it disturbs my sleep. And so it's not for everybody. And I value sleep quality over a lot of things these days. So, experiment with it and see how it works. But yeah, my friend and colleague Luke Van Loon would say, it's not a bad strategy, not a bad thing to try. They do it. I know they've done some trials in hospitalized patients, and it's maybe that's the way to go. But large bolus right before you go to sleep, not a bad idea for some people, maybe.
What are some of the areas over the years that you've changed your mind on?
Quite a few, actually. There's probably two big ones. One is, 20 years ago, protein quality, animals better than plant. Absolutely. The more plant you eat, you just have to eat more protein, or maybe you're sacrificing some gains, and et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward to today, data that we've generated, other labs have generated, would suggest otherwise, and that plant-based proteins are in my mind, they're maybe a little bit different. So if you want, to equalize the two, maybe eat 10% more protein if you're eating plant-based or vegan or something like that. And that really upsets people. And I get it, because you just want an answer. I posted something on Instagram the other day, and a comment that somebody made was, well, doesn't all of this just boil down to like, it depends? And what does that help? And I'm like, yeah, it does. But science is rarely absolute, right? So answers change based on changing knowledge. And so that's what I think upsets people. It doesn't, it wasn't what they learned yesterday. It's new. So that's how science works. And the science these days says, plant-based or plant proteins, first, you have a lot more choice now than you ever did. And I get it. They're processed foods that are made with plants and put together. But that's led to sort of a revolution in people's choice. And those types of foods are probably not a bad source of protein. Everything that we've done, you just got to eat enough. I think that 1.6 grams per kilo, 0.7 grams per pound, you kind of cover a lot of bases, and it doesn't matter whether it comes from plants or animals. And that's a big one. I mean, I think the other one is, asked me 20 years ago how important protein was for gaining muscle mass. And I just said, it's king, like it's huge and everything. And then studies march on. We've done some. Lots of other groups have contributed to the area, and you do a synthesis of the evidence that's out there. So a meta-analysis, and for people that maybe don't know what that is, or maybe have never heard of it, meta-analysis is basically looking at systematically searching through all of the studies. When I say all, within a confined criteria that have been done, and having a consensus answer based on basically mathematically looking at all of those studies. And, that method was invented and came into being at my university, at McMaster. So, we're responsible for gifting this to the world. But it's also the basis of, making decisions over life-saving therapies in cancers and in cardiovascular drugs and lots of really important areas. So let's just say the protein affecting muscle mass gain is, I'm not winning any Nobel Prizes on this. So, and I don't have a horse in the race and everything. But I would have said 20 years ago, protein is king. It's super important. You got to get it. You got to eat more. And the more you eat, the more is better. Better is better than better. And now it's sort of like, nah, it's a thin slice on top. Like you bake the cake. In other words, you make the muscle by going to the gym, by lifting weights and doing it regularly. If you really want to tweak things, then eat a little bit more protein. I'm going to say a little bit, like twice the RDA, so 1.6. So it's not a trivial amount of protein. It is more than is recommended for sure. But what it adds is it's a layer of icing on the cake, and that really pisses people off. Because for a long time, I think we unwittingly sort of contributed to the narrative, and I would admit this frankly. And even in our papers, I go back and read them, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's what we thought at the time. And now I just think it's a much more subtle tweak that you can make in your routine, which maybe goes back to my answer of, if you want more muscle, what should you really be doing? Well, you need to be lifting weights, but the nutrition piece is important. The pieces inside the piece, less important. And then the pieces inside the pieces, and the nuance can get boiled down and quite reductionist, but for the most part, it's pretty broad strokes stuff. I think that's a little bit of aging in there as well, and I'll just call it life wisdom or something like that. Is that I'm like, remember those things I used to worry about, but maybe that's just me. So maybe it's my persona that's changing as well. So I have to acknowledge that, but I still read, and we still do a lot of science around here. So I think it's I think it's science too.
Coming back to the plant protein piece.
Yeah.
Just looking for a little bit more nuance there, given we talked about leucine, the importance of that for MPS.
Yeah.
The essential amino acids. You mentioned early on the fact that soy is a great source of plant-based protein.
Yep.
How do we look at the nuance of amino acids, MPS, when it comes to somebody on a plant-only diet or vegan diet?
Right.
And then when it comes to supplementing that diet with a plant protein, which would you recommend?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to, be vegan or eat plant-based from health otherwise, and whether that's cardiovascular or, a comment about carbon footprint, greenhouse gas emissions, which I definitely don't want to get into because it's not my area at all, but, or the choice that people make, ethical, religious, whatever reason, whatever it is that you make that choice, to eat that way. So, I'll just start out by saying that from a protein standpoint, you do have to eat more. But I think that how much more, I used to think it was, 30 to 40%. I think it's closer now to sort of 10 to 15% more if you're on plant-based. It might be as high as 20% if you're vegan. But if you're a judicious vegan, in other words, you know how to complement proteins, things like textured vegetable protein is a good source, and et cetera, of protein. You get those things figured out, but by judicious, I mean educated, and that you plan your meals. You can be vegan and eat, a slice of white Wonder bread and drink a Diet Coke, but that doesn't make you a good vegan, right? And then just like you can be a crummy omnivore, you can eat an Oreo and you're vegan, or you get my point, right? Not to overstress on it, but I think what's happened out in the world is that people have become very polarized in their views, and it's become now a battle of philosophy rather than science. But the reality is that, if you're eating those plant-based things, you just got to eat a little bit more protein. If you add plant-based protein powder, then the arguments become largely moot. They're slightly lower quality, but we just finished a study in older men, and we compared whey to pea protein. And when we got these older guys up to 1.6 grams, it didn't matter whether you were eating whey or pea. We had a third condition where people got collagen, and then it mattered because collagen is a very low quality protein. We used to spray it on farmers' fields as fertilizer. Now there's a good marketing machine behind it, and it improves your skin, your nails, and ostensibly your connective tissue, et cetera. But yeah, so whey and pea, no difference. Both of them better than collagen, but you got to eat, a little bit more protein for sure.
Would pea be your number one choice in the plant world?
I don't know if it'd be my number one.
For a powder, somebody wanted to buy a supplement.
I still think it's soy. And I know a lot of people, they're, isoflavones, these are feminizing hormones. That's complete garbage. A lot of people, because of the soy lecithin that's in there, they say that's GMO. And if that's your belief, then fine, don't eat soy. But it's the highest quality plant protein that's out there for sure.
And specifically honing in on the leucine, is that high in soy or in pea?
Yeah, it's pretty high in soy. It's not as high in pea as it is in soy, but again, if you get to enough protein, it doesn't matter. Oddly enough, I don't know why, and people ask me why. I don't know, but corn protein is high in leucine, and I have no concept. But one thing, and I'll just mention this because I think it's really cool, and when I mention it to my students, they don't think it's so cool, but I told them, I'm like, historically, isn't it amazing that in these food, I'll call them insecure regions, or for regions of, religious nature, they just didn't have very many animals and livestock around. They figured out that the beans or a legume and a grain paired together were good. I'm like red beans and rice in the Caribbean, black beans and corn in South America, lentils and rice in India, soy and rice in lots of Southeast Asia. And they just glaze over. And I'm like, I think that's insanely fascinating, but they're not quite as convinced. But I think that's, again, it's a testimony to, human adaptability that we don't need meat to survive. I eat meat. I flat out admit that. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool omnivore, but I probably eat less than I did. And I think my 3 sons, even though they're, I think, very protein aware, will eat less than I did. And they're, you can't feed 9 billion people, at least with the methods that we have for agriculture.
Last question for you. Male versus female.
Ooh, okay.
Any differences when it comes to protein intake, resistance training?
My take on this is there probably are some differences, but they're relatively small. I mean, short of, reproductive hormonal issues, which, the work that we've done and meta-analyzed and lots of other people have done appear to be relatively trivial. There is a shift around menopause in women that happens with bone, and it also happens with muscle as well. So, a strong message is for women to really think about maintaining and gaining some strength heading into menopause, because it's a transition point from a musculoskeletal standpoint. Outside of that, we're the same species, right? And I think the differences are relatively subtle, and that's not to poo-poo any differences in pathological disease mechanisms, which we've done a crummy job researching women, absolutely. But the bottom line is, from muscle, protein, resistance training, we don't see an awful lot of difference between them. And for the record, again, I know men have testosterone, women don't. So, blah, 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 blah. But once you're post-pubertal, if you get grown males, females to lift weights, men have more muscle than women, but relatively speaking, they gain the same amount. They go up proportionate to how much muscle they gain. So you don't need testosterone to gain muscle. It's the local action of the lifting the weight that drives the process. So, and also, a lot of women will say, "Oh, I don't want to muscle up and get huge," and I'm like, I've never seen that happen. Just be honest. So, but it's going to be more important, I think, even for women than it is for men to be strong going into your later years, for sure.
One more question for you. Frequency of resistance training. If somebody wants to optimize for MPS, is it best just to go by muscle soreness, have a day off in between doing resistance training? How do we figure out the frequency? Yeah,
soreness, I don't think is a good guide for anything. I'm of the camp, no pain, particularly at my age, because I want to come back and train tomorrow or the next day. There's a sweet spot probably somewhere between 2 to 3 times a week. I think really squeezes a lot out of the cloth. You pretty much got a lot of the benefits there. Always 1 time a week or something, always much, much, much better than nothing. But once you've got the 1 time a week mastered, then I'd say 2. And, it's sort of like how much do you want to twist the cloth? But somewhere between 2 to 3 times a week, and you've got it all covered.
All right. Good place to end it. Stu, I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your wisdom.
My pleasure.
This was great. We're going to link up your social media, everything in the show notes. Thank you.
Okay. My pleasure.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
Your whole goal in life is to get the highest lean mass at the lowest fat mass. Basically, you want to be a bodybuilder. So if I just snap my fingers and you're a bodybuilder, you have very little body fat, tons of muscle.